Welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. Lecture 2 will cover some basic tools of the economist. First, it is helpful to take an in-depth look at opportunity costs. As we mentioned last time, the opportunity cost is the highest valued alternative that is foregone or sacrificed when a choice is made. And the fundamental economic problem is scarcity, and many of our choices necessarily involve costly trade-offs. But as economists, when considering these opportunity costs, it's important to look at the real goods and services that we give up when we make a choice, rather than the monetary costs associated with engaging in purchases or making a decision. For example, one common opportunity cost that we need to analyze is the opportunity cost of going to college. Because the true cost of going to college is not simply the expenses for tuition, food, room and board, and books, but they also include what that money could have purchased in its next highest valued alternative. In addition, when we go to college, many of us are giving up the opportunity to work in a full-time job. And typically, students incur costs of up to $80,000 or more in foregone income during their stay in college. One important principle that we should note through the rest of the course is that trade creates value because the way that we value goods and services is ultimately subjective. It depends on personal preferences, and these can change over time. When two individuals engage in voluntary trade, both parties expect to be better off after the trade than before the trade. And even if no new goods and services are produced, trade increases the value that individuals get from their property. For example, let's say you're given a baseball card that is highly valuable to a collector. However, you have no interest in baseball whatsoever, but you would like to have a new comic book for your collection. If you trade this card for a comic book, you will be made better off. Likewise, an individual who traded with you values a baseball card more than he values his comic book, or else he would not have engaged in a trade in the first place. The end result is that both individuals are better off due to the subjective nature in the way that we value our property. One problem that we need to consider as economists is that markets are not always as efficient as we would like them to be. Ideally, we would have a good that we would like to trade to someone else for something that we highly value. However, there are costs that we incur in order to get to that trade. These costs are known as transaction costs, and they prevent many trades from occurring. More technically, transaction costs refer to the time, effort, and resources needed to search out, negotiate, and complete an exchange. So think of transaction costs as resources that you have to give up in order to make a trade. For example, let's say you want to buy a used car. You often face significant transaction costs in finding a seller, gathering information on the car, and getting to the trading location. Buying a car is not as easy as going to a supermarket and simply picking up a product and bringing it to the cashier. There are many costs associated with finding the type of car that you want and finding a buyer who is close by. However, middlemen such as car dealerships help us to reduce these costs by bringing together buyers and sellers. One of the most important economic institutions is the institution of property rights. Property rights include the right to exclusive use of one's property, legal protection against theft, and the right to trade or transfer an item. For example, let's say your property includes your automobile. You have the exclusive right to drive that vehicle, and you can prevent others from using that vehicle without your permission. In addition, you have the right of legal protection against theft, and if somebody attempts to steal your vehicle, you have protection under U.S. courts. Secondly, you have the right to trade, including selling your vehicle, or transferring the item as a gift. Also, Property rights promote economic activity and progress by providing incentives to, number one, use resources in ways that are beneficial to others. For example, if we own a store, we will try to use our resources in the most productive way in order to increase our profits. Number two, we have the incentive to care for and properly manage our property, because we are the ones that are going to incur the benefits and costs associated with our care of the property. Number three, we have the incentive to conserve our resources for future use. The best way to think about incentive number three would be the example of a farmer who has the incentive to take care of his land long into the future to increase the value of that land if he goes to sell it, or to protect his future profits from the yields of his crop. And number four, we want to lower the probability that our property damages the property of others, because we can be held accountable in courts of law for damaging other people's property. Another tool used by economists is the production possibilities curve, also known as a production possibilities frontier. The definition is that this curve illustrates all possible bundles of total output that could be produced assuming, number one, we have a fixed amount of productive resources. These resources include land, labor, and capital. Number two, we assume that we have a given amount of technical knowledge and technology. And finally, we have full and efficient use of those resources. This production possibilities curve can be expanded in four ways. One, we can increase our resource base. One way that we can do this is by channeling more money into capital investment. That is, we can build factories and machines that can produce more goods and services in the future. We can have technological change so that we can be more productive. Also, institutional rules can change. For example, if we have stronger property rights in a given state or nation, then we would think that the society would be more productive in the long run. And finally, we could take less leisure time and simply work more hours. Now, if we look at the production possibilities curve in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, we can see that this blue curve represents all possible bundles of total output of butter and guns. All points along the curve represent the maximum output that we can obtain from efficient production. For example, points A, B, C, and D are combinations of guns and butter at maximum efficient production. Now, all points above the curve are unobtainable, given our amount of productive resources, our technical knowledge, and full and efficient production. All points within the curve would suggest that we are not employing our resources efficiently, and that we could ultimately produce more guns or more butter, or perhaps more of both. Now, if we move from point A to B on our production possibilities curve, we will gain 10 additional units of butter. However, the opportunity cost of producing 10 more units of butter is that we have to give up 5 units of guns. Now, we can determine the opportunity cost of producing butter at every point along this curve simply by taking the first derivative of the function. This is because the slope of the curve represents how many guns we have to give up in order to produce 1 more unit of butter. And finally, we should note that this particular curve is concave, because as we specialize in the production of either butter or guns, as we move to the complete production of only one good, the resources that we have for producing them ultimately become less efficient. That is, it is easier for us to produce some combination of guns and butter than to produce just one or the other good. Let's take a look at specialization in trade. A group of individuals can become more productive if each person specializes in the production of goods and services for which they have the lowest opportunity cost. This is known as the law of comparative advantage. Individuals can gain by producing items that they can cheaply produce and engage in voluntary exchange. That is, they have the lowest opportunity cost of producing this good or service. For example, in the United States, we have a comparative advantage at producing technology and software, but Chinese workers, on the other hand, have a comparative advantage at manufacturing hardware. Think about this. If American workers at Apple Incorporated assembled iPhones instead of programming, they would be giving up the opportunity to design cutting-edge operating systems. Clearly, both countries are better off when they specialize in what they are good at and what they can cheaply produce, and then trade the output at the end. If countries engage in this type of specialization and trade, they ultimately can become better off because of the gains from trade, and they can have a higher total level of output. One last distinction that we need to make in this course is the difference between capitalism and socialism. You may hear about these key terms in the news, and it is important to understand the difference. Capitalism refers to an economic system whereby productive resources and property are privately owned. Resources are allocated by voluntary trade through the market price mechanism. Secondly, socialism is a system of organization in which ownership and control of the means of production ultimately rests with the state or government. The allocation of resources is determined by the government through centralized planning. Most systems, including our own, adopt a mixture of market-based and command and control-based allocation of resources. For example, agriculture is largely allocated through the use of a free market. However, if we look at education, much of the allocation of education in the United States is centrally planned and determined by the government.